3 weeks before my father died, my brother came home for the first time in 6 years. He didn't come to hold Dad's hand. He didn't come to sit with him in the evenings when Dad forgot where he was and started calling out for our mother, who'd been gone for 11 years. He didn't come to change a diaper, or crush a pill into applesauce, or drive 40 minutes each way to a specialist appointment in Lincoln, only to sit in a waiting room for 2 hours and hear the same thing you heard the last time. He came home with a lawyer and a will that nobody, not me, not Dad's longtime attorney in town, not the woman who had known our family for 4 decades had ever seen before. My name was nowhere in it. My brother was getting the farm, the equipment, the mineral rights, the savings account, and the house Dad built with his own hands in 1974. All of it, 100%. I stood in that kitchen, the kitchen I'd eaten breakfast in every morning for the last 6 years, and I read that document 3 times. My hands were completely steady. I don't know why. Maybe after everything I'd been through with Dad, my body had simply run out of the kind of energy it takes to fall apart. I set the papers down on the table. I looked at my brother, and I said, very quietly, "Where did this come from?" he said. Dad and I talked about it. I said, when he said, "Over the years," that was the moment I knew something was deeply, irreversibly wrong, because for the last 3 years, our father hadn't been capable of talking about anything in a sustained, meaningful way. He could tell you about a thunderstorm from 1963 with perfect clarity. He could not tell you what year it was, or who the president was, or what he'd had for breakfast. He had introduced me to his own night nurse as the neighbor boy 6 months before he died. He had not been drafting wills. But I didn't say any of that yet. I just nodded. I said I needed a few days to look things over. My brother smiled in a way that made something cold settle in my chest. And then I called Ruth. Let me back up. Because to understand what comes next, you need to understand what the years before it looked like. My name is Gerald. I'm 63 years old. I grew up on a family farm outside a small town in eastern Nebraska. The kind of place where the grain elevator is the tallest building and everyone knows what you drive. My father, Leonard, farmed corn and soybeans his whole life. He wasn't a rich man, but he was a careful one. Every dollar he ever made went back into the land or got put away for later. By the time I was grown, that farm was paid off. The equipment was owned outright. And there was a modest savings account that represented 40 years of discipline and sacrifice. I have one brother. His name is Douglas, and he's 5 years older than me. Doug left Nebraska the day after he graduated high school and never really looked back. He went to Omaha, then Kansas City, then Phoenix, then somewhere in Colorado. He did well enough. He got into real estate, made some money, lost some, made more. He married twice. He called it Christmas, and sometimes on Dad's birthday. He was not unkind. Exactly. But he was absent in the way that some people are absent, not cruelly. Just completely. I stayed. I stayed because I wanted to. I stayed because I loved the land, and I loved my father, and I didn't have much ambition for somewhere else. I farmed alongside Dad through my 30s and into my 40s. When Mom died of a stroke 11 years ago, I moved back into the house full-time to help him manage. When he started forgetting things, small things at first, keys and names and appointments, I started paying closer attention. When the forgetting got worse, I took him to Lincoln, got the diagnosis, and reorganized my life around it. Dementia does not arrive all at once. It comes in stages. And each stage takes something, First, it takes the edges, the recent memories, the sharp details. Then, it takes the middle, the names, the faces, the sense of what day or year it is. Then, in the end, it takes the core. The person you knew is still there. Occasionally. In flashes, a laugh, a phrase, a moment of recognition that breaks your heart because it reminds you of what's missing. And then, even those flashes get farther apart. I watched my father go through all of it. I was the one who called the doctor when he wandered out of the house at 3 in the morning, and I found him standing in the south field in his pajamas, looking at something I couldn't see. I was the one who sat with him through the nights when he was frightened and confused, when he grabbed my arm and asked me, with real terror in his eyes, who I was and why I was in his house. I was the one who made sure he was warm, that he was eating that his medications were right, that his dignity was preserved as much as could be managed. Doug called twice in 6 years. Once to check in, once to ask if Dad had ever mentioned updating the estate plan. I thought that was an odd question. I answered it honestly, yes. Dad and I had talked about it, and everything was in order. And Dad's attorney in town had the paperwork. Doug said, "Good to know." He didn't ask anything else. That was 14 months before he showed up at the door with a lawyer. Ruth Halpern has been a licensed notary public in our county for 41 years. She is 72 years old, 5'2", and she keeps a filing cabinet in the back room of her house that contains a copy of every document she has ever witnessed. Not just a log copies. She started doing it early in her career because she had a dispute with a bank once, and it taught her that paper is the only thing that doesn't change its story. She has been keeping those copies ever since. She witnessed my father's original will 15 years ago. She remembered it. She remembered it because Leonard had brought her a jar of honey from his neighbor's hives as a thank you, which she thought was charming. And because he'd sat across from her at her kitchen table and been so precise and deliberate about the language that she'd noted it in her own records, he wanted to make sure both his sons were treated fairly. He wanted the farm to go to Gerald. That's me, because Gerald was the one working it. He wanted a portion of the savings split evenly. He'd thought about it clearly and carefully. And his signature that day had been the firm, controlled signature of a man entirely in possession of himself. She had a copy of that signature. When I called her the evening after Doug showed up, I didn't tell her everything right away. I just asked if she still had the file from 15 years ago. She said she did. I asked if she'd be willing to look at something. She said, "Gerald." "What's going on?" I told her. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Bring me the new document. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters." Part of me, in those first few days, wanted to believe I was wrong. Douglas is my brother. We grew up in the same house, slept in the same room until I was 9, worked the same fields. We are not close. We haven't been for a long time, but he is still my brother. And there is something in you that resists the conclusion that a person you share blood with is capable of what I was starting to suspect. I kept looking for the alternative explanation. Maybe Dad had been clearer than I thought on some particular day. Maybe this was a document from years ago that I simply hadn't known about. Maybe Doug had a version of events that made sense if I just heard it. I sat with those possibilities for about 48 hours. And then I drove to Ruth's house. She had both documents on her kitchen table when I arrived, the original from 15 years ago and a copy of the new one Doug had presented. She had her reading glasses on, and she had a magnifying lamp that she used for close work. She didn't say anything to me when I came in. She just pointed at a chair. I sat down. She studied the documents for a long time, maybe 15 minutes. I watched her face. It didn't move much. Ruth is not a dramatic person. She spent 4 decades witnessing other people's most important moments without inserting herself into them. And it had made her very still. Finally, she set down the magnifying lamp. She took her glasses off. She looked at me. She said, "Gerald, your father did not sign this. I had been prepared for it. I thought I was prepared for it. It still hit me like something physical." She explained it carefully. The signature on the new will, the one Douglas had presented, shared some surface characteristics with my father's signature. The general shape of the L, the trailing line of the D. But the pressure was wrong. The hesitation marks were wrong. A person forging a signature they've studied produces something that looks like a copy, and copies are never quite right in the way a real thing is right. They are too careful. They lack the unconscious ease of someone signing their own name for the 6,000th time. And there was something else. My father, in his last 2 years, had developed a tremor. It was a documented side effect of one of his medications, and it was visible in everything he wrote: birthday cards, check stubs, the occasional note to the night nurse. The tremor showed up as a slight irregularity in every letter, a subtle shake in every line. The signature on the new will was smooth. It was, Ruth said, the signature of someone trying to replicate how Leonard had signed 15 years ago, before the tremor, before the disease. Whoever had done this had studied the old documents. They had been careful. They had almost gotten it right. Almost. If you've ever sat with evidence of a betrayal, this Sirius really sat with it. In a quiet kitchen, watching the shape of your life rearrange itself, you know that the feeling isn't exactly anger. Not at first. It's something quieter and stranger than that. It's the sensation of a floor you trusted turning out to be hollow. I drove home, and I did not speak to Douglas that night. He was staying in the guest room that had been his childhood bedroom. The room I'd repainted 3 years ago, because it needed it. The room I'd kept ready on the off chance he ever actually came home. I made dinner. I set the table for 2. I ate. I cleaned up. I went to bed. The next morning, I made a phone call to the county attorney's office, and another call to Dad's longtime attorney, a man named Paul Vetter, who had handled our family's legal needs for 30 years, and who, when I explained what I had found, went very quiet in a way that told me he was not entirely surprised. Paul had been uneasy about something. He hadn't been able to identify it at the time. Douglas had called him 6 weeks before Dad died, before Douglas even came home, asking questions about the estate, specific questions. Questions about whether a will executed in a different county would be recognized. Questions about timing. Paul had answered them as a courtesy. He had thought they were odd. He had not acted on it. He acted on it now. I want to tell you what those last 3 weeks were like. Because Douglas was still in the house, and I still had a father to care for. This is the part that people don't think about in stories like this. You don't get to pause the hard parts while you deal with the other hard parts. Dad was still in his hospital bed in the living room. We'd set it up there 2 years earlier because the stairs had become too much, and he still needed everything he'd always needed. He was sleeping more now, which the hospice nurse had told us was part of the process. On his good days, he recognized me. On his bad days, he called me by a name I didn't know. Some boy from his past I couldn't identify. Douglas would come and sit with him sometimes. I watched that from the doorway once. He sat in the chair by the bed and held Dad's hand. And Dad's eyes were closed. Doug wasn't doing anything sinister. He was just sitting. And I thought, this is the thing that tears you apart about families. Isn't it? People can be cruel and loving at the same time. People can betray you and still love you. In their way. I'm not sure which is worse. I didn't say anything to him. Not yet. Paul Vetter had advised me to say nothing. To let the process move. to not alert Douglas that we knew what we knew. I kept making dinner. I kept caring for Dad. I kept driving to appointments and filling prescriptions and doing the 1,000 small invisible things that had structured my days for 6 years. Dad died on a Thursday morning. Just after 6 a.m. I was in the room. Douglas came in 2 minutes later, half asleep from down the hall. We sat together with our father for a while. Whatever else was true, that part was real. The will contest was filed within 60 days of Dad's death. Paul Veta henledet. He brought in a forensic document examiner from Omaha, a woman named Dr. Camille Osei, who had testified in over 200 forgery cases and who confirmed everything Ruth had observed, with the addition of several technical findings about ink composition and paper age that I won't pretend to fully understand. The short version, the paper used for the new will, was consistent with stock purchased within the previous 2 years, despite the document's purported date being 4 years earlier. The ink chemistry was inconsistent with the pen supposedly used, and the signature analysis confirmed what Ruth had seen. The document was a forgery. Douglas had hired a traveling notary, someone he found online, in another county, to witness the document. That notary had a short professional history and a longer disciplinary record. She had notarized the document without verifying the signatory's identity through any means beyond Douglas's word. When investigators contacted her, she initially held to her account. She did not hold for long. The county attorney's office opened a criminal investigation. I want to be honest about how I felt when that became real, when this stopped being a family dispute and became a legal proceeding. I didn't feel satisfaction. Exactly. I felt something more like grief with a different texture. This was my brother. This was the person I'd shared a bedroom with. This was the person I thought might come home someday and finally see what I'd built here, what Dad and I had built together, and be proud of it. He had been thinking about how to take it. There was a moment, about 3 weeks into the investigation, when Douglas called me. I had been expecting it. I let it ring twice before I answered. He didn't start with an apology. He started with justification. He said he deserved a fair share. He said I'd had years of free housing. He said Dad had always told him the farm would be split evenly. He said he'd just been trying to get what was rightfully his. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "Douglas, I know what you did. Paul knows what you did. Ruth knows what you did. The document examiner knows what you did. And now the county attorney knows what you did." Silence. I said, "If there's something you want to say to me that isn't a justification, I'm willing to hear it." More silence. He said, "I needed the money." Jerry. It was the first honest thing he'd said, and I didn't know what to do with it. Exactly. I still don't. It didn't fix anything. It didn't undo 6 years or 3 weeks or 1 forged signature. But it was real. And after everything, real felt like something. I said, "I know." And I hung up. Here's what happened in the end. And I'll be straightforward about it because I think you deserve to know. The criminal investigation resulted in Douglas being charged with forgery and fraud. He reached a plea agreement. I was not party to the negotiations. But Paul kept me informed. He did not go to prison, which I have complicated feelings about and which I've made peace with in my own way. He paid restitution. He paid legal fees. He is no longer in a position to make the kind of decisions he was trying to make. The original will was upheld. The farm is mine, not because I wanted to win, but because that's what my father actually wanted. The savings were distributed exactly as Dad had intended. The equipment, the mineral rights, the house he built in 1974, I have walked every acre of this farm since then and thought about what it cost to keep it. Not financially. That's not what I mean. I mean the years. I mean the nights. I mean the 1,000 mornings I woke up tired and made breakfast for a man who sometimes didn't know who I was and still needed to eat. I mean the grief that comes, not all at once, but in installments. Over years. As a person you love becomes someone else, and then becomes no one, and then becomes a memory. I mean what it costs to stay. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry at Douglas. I've thought about that question more than I expected to. The honest answer is not anymore. I was. For a while, a deep, quiet, structural kind of angry that wasn't explosive but was constant. The way a load-bearing beam is constant. It held me upright, and it held me back at the same time. But anger takes energy. And I am 63 years old. And I have a farm to run. And in the evenings, when the light goes long and gold over the fields, I think about my father walking these same rows. And I think about my mother. And I think about all the years of ordinary life that happened here before any of the rest of it. I am not a man who believes in dramatic closure. Life doesn't close. It just continues. And you carry things with you. And eventually the weight of what you carry either crushes you or becomes part of how you walk. I chose the second one. Ruth still lives 2 miles down the road. We have coffee on Thursday mornings. She has never once said I told you so. Which is not nothing. Paul Vetter retired last year. I sent flowers to his office on his last day. His assistant called to tell me. He cried a little when he got them. The farm is, I don't have a word for it. It's mine. But it's bigger than mine. It was my father's and his father's before that. And every person who ever worked it left something of themselves in the soil. I feel that in a way, I can't explain and don't try to. I plant in the spring. I harvest in the fall. I am still here. If you've dealt with inheritance fraud, with will disputes, with a family member who took advantage of a parent's illness, I want you to know something. Document everything. Keep records. Find the Ruths in your life, the people who've been watching carefully for 40 years and who know when something isn't right. They exist. They're out there. And they remember. The thing about a forgery is that it depends on the original being forgotten. It depends on no one looking too closely. It depends on the assumption that careful, modest, ordinary people don't keep copies. Ruth kept copies. She always kept copies. And because of that, my father's real wishes, the careful, deliberate, loving wishes of a man who thought hard about what was fair and what was right, those wishes are the ones that stand. That's not a small thing. That's everything. If stories like this speak to something you've lived through, I'd be glad if you subscribed. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And it means these stories reach the people who need them. I'll leave you with this. On the night before the hospice nurse told us Dad had maybe a week left, I sat by his bed and held his hand. He was mostly asleep. But at one point, his eyes opened. And he looked at me, really looked at me. The way he used to before any of it. And he said my name, just my name. Gerald. Clear as a bell. No tremor. No confusion. Just my name. Said the way only your father says it. Then he closed his eyes again. I don't know if he was there in that moment, or somewhere in the past, or somewhere I can't imagine. I don't know if he knew what was coming, for him or for us. I don't know what he was trying to say, but I know he said my name, and I was there to hear it. And that more than the farm, more than the outcome, more than any of it, is the thing I'll carry longest. Thanks for listening.